Welcome to our deep dive into thought leadership at UC San Diego's Rady School of Management. We have a fascinating professor who really deals in a number of interdisciplinary approaches to examine how people make decisions. We're going to get into this in a moment, but I want to introduce our guest, Uma Karmarkar, who is a professor, actually a joint professor, joint appointment at both the Rady School of Management and the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. Uma has also taught at the Harvard Business School for 6 years, was a visiting professor for a year at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business, and has been at Rady teaching a number of things, but particularly the core course in marketing since 2017. She has the unique distinction of having two PhDs. One was not enough for Uma. She has a PhD in consumer behavior from Stanford and a PhD in neuroscience from UCLA. She has a bachelor's degree in symbolic systems. That is a fascinating subject from Stanford as well. Welcome, Uma.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to have this conversation.
So I'm fascinated by the fact that you bring three distinct fields: behavioral economics, neuroscience, and essentially consumer marketing, and blend them together in a unique way to come up with insights on how people make decisions, both economic decisions and just behavioral decisions. How did you even get into that?
That's a fun question. So my initial training was in neuroscience. I was going to say traditional neuroscience, but even neuroscience really isn't a traditional discipline. So I was doing research on how the brain processes information in the world around us to help us think, even in a neuroscience lab, even thinking about how individual cells connect. So my original degree, I looked at how the mechanisms underlying learning and memory, even how we process time, all these pieces of how we use the information in the world around us to learn and think and make sense of things. In some ways, decision-making is really just well, not just, but decision-making is the top dog in those kinds of cognitive processes. It uses learning and memory and perceptions of time and emotion and so many different facets of how we think. So it gives you this amazing opportunity to study a lot of cool facets of the brain and of psychology, while also understanding how these things work in the real world. And so taking that neuroscience underpinning, and expanding it out into the messiness of how we actually do these things, when you might have a screaming kid on one hip, or when you're outside the lab and there are 20 people or 20 firms trying to get your attention, seemed like a really interesting and really challenging problem.
That's great. Now, what exactly are neuroeconomics?
Yeah, so this term is often surprising or confusing for people, and I have a terrible confession that I'm about to make. I'm not actually an economist. I'm definitely a neuroscientist, definitely got psychology covered, but not actually an economist. So I feel like there's a little bait and switch in that title. But what we in the field of neuroeconomics believe is that it refers to the study of real consequential decision-making done from brain all the way to behavior. And the economics part is because it does interact with behavioral economics, which is looked at decisions basically that involve money, decisions in economic systems, which is what marketing does as well. So by bringing all of these things together, we get a hopefully richer understanding of what people do and why they do it, with a scientific underpinning that, in the best case scenario, would let us make predictions about how people are going to respond to these types of environments as they grow, as they change, as new things come at us, whether it's technology or just the social environment we live in. The study of these decisions has really been around in traditional disciplines for a very long time. Behavioral economics has existed, so have various forms of psychology, whether clinical, social, cognitive, or consumer psychology. And neuroscientists have certainly studied decision-making and the underpinning of decision-making in systems that range from humans like us all the way to animals and, sea slugs and things like that, that also make decisions to stay alive. So the pieces have always been there. Enough of the science in enough places came together in a way that let neuroeconomists draw those pieces together and hopefully further all of those spaces in an integrated way.
Now, beyond intellectual curiosity, I wonder what actually attracted you to the field.
Absolutely. So part of it again is taking all this scientific knowledge, all this deep understanding, and making an impact. Making an impact in understanding how people are going to make these choices. Now, again, just to clarify, I'm a marketing professor. So how do we make decisions about what do we buy? How should consumers make decisions about what we buy? What factors matter? What don't? I mentioned that one of the early things that got me interested in science was how do we process all the information in the world around us? Well, imagine pulling up a website, go to your favorite e-commerce site, go to a retail website. There's so much information there, and it can be overwhelming, but actually often we're pretty good at it. We are surprisingly good at shopping in general. We go to the grocery store, it doesn't cause us to fall down in trauma. We go and pull up Nike.com, we can buy a pair of shoes. That's amazing. That's amazing that we're so good at this. So how do we do this, and what parts do or don't matter for helping us make better decisions, for helping firms understand what consumers want? Those questions take the science and take it into the real world in really interesting ways, and really honestly important ways. The best case scenario in marketing is when the firm does something valuable and a consumer benefits and is willing to offer money. And I know that's probably marketing core 101, but if we want to achieve that, we need to understand what people want and need and how they make those choices.
So I wonder, how does the brain react when it actually sees a product on a screen or makes these choices? I'm imagining that you are looking inside one's head at some point, given your bent on neuroscience, and seeing how the brain activates.
I am, in fact, and this is one of my favorite questions because it
This
is
is like a Twilight Zone, okay, for me.
It's at the core of some of my research. So I do functional magnetic resonance imaging or magnetic resonance imaging. If you've ever had the misfortune to, for example, maybe put your knee out, you've probably gone in an MRI scanner. It's
Oh, yeah.
like a sophisticated, complicated medical piece of technology that we also can use for research. So, not quite an X-ray, but it looks at the different tissue in the brain and it can tell which parts of the brain are more engaged in a task than others when you're doing the task. And that lets us learn quite a bit about how different forms of decision-making or value are represented in the brain. So when we see a product, whether it's on the screen, in an e-commerce site, or in a real-world store, a lot of things are happening at the same time. And one of the most interesting things that I think we've learned from the field of neuroeconomics is that there are multiple forms or facets or flavors of value in the brain. So you might think, what's the value of a product? Oh, it's how much I'm willing to pay for it. And there is a part of the brain that responds to how much we're willing to pay for something. In general, the area called medial prefrontal cortex codes for willingness to pay, or for the economists, consumer surplus, or how good of a deal we think that we're getting when we look at this product. But there's also a part of the brain that just responds to how much you like it. I will often joke that this is sort of your crow part of your brain, right? It sees something shiny and it goes, ooh, I like that a lot, or I don't care. But the activity in this brain part, the ventral striatum, correlates with how much you like or want something regardless of how much you want to pay for it. And I think that's really interesting that we can separate those two things in terms of brain activity, that we hold these two types of value at the same time. And intuitively, it kind of makes sense. You can really like chocolate cake, even if right now you might not be willing to pay more than a couple dollars for it. So I can show you a piece of chocolate cake. You know it's $10. You know it's one of the best chefs in the world. But today, you have a budget. You don't have the money for it right now. You might not be willing to pay more than $4, for example. And so your brain can store, I love chocolate cake, and today only worth $4 at the same time. Other researchers have shown that there are so many other pieces of this decision-making going off and activating. There's the social value of your decision. Suppose I'm looking at an Hermes or a Chanel scarf. Not only how much valuable is it to me, but how much value does this have to the people who are going to see me wearing that scarf or notice
Right.
the luxury branding?
Right.
How is the brand represented? How am I thinking about my relationship to the firm? There's a part of the brain that codes how challenging the decision itself is. So not just the product, but I'm coding how hard it is for me to make a choice about that product if I'm thinking about buying it. So anterior cingulate activates more if you're having a hard time choosing between two really lovely things than if you're having a really easy decision between something you love and something you hate. So all these different processes coming together, interacting with each other to create this output, this outset of decision where you either put down the money or walk away.
And I think I read one of your studies where how something is presented on a screen can obviously influence whether one buys or does not. Is that
In
right?
so many different ways. That's exactly right. So when someone's in the scanner, e-commerce is a good analogy for what they're doing because they're looking at a screen and you could say, well, that's not how people buy things. And 50 years ago, you'd be right. But now that's exactly how people buy things as they scroll through the mouse when they're looking at the screen. So companies now have the opportunity to structure our e-commerce experience. There's the page that you land on. There's what information is on the screen. There's what you're going to see first, what's in the big text versus the little text. There's even what other items are recommended. My
Wow.
research has shown that when you see the price first, you activate your brain differently than when you see the product first. So if you catch a sign or an indication, everything on this page, $25, or if you search on price, for example, you ask yourself a different shopping question than if you just see a page of products. When you search on price first, you're asking yourself, is it worth it? Now, that's a different question from do I like it? So when you see the product first, you ask yourself, do I like it? When you see the price first, you ask yourself, is it worth it? And those can lead to different decisions. Imagine asking yourself, do I like it for batteries? That's just weird. Do I like batteries? I mean, they seem useful. I don't know what the answer to that question. Sure, they're fun.
Actually, you're bringing up a real life example because this morning I was looking at lights that you put over a photograph on a wall.
Yeah.
And one consumer was arguing that the battery life in this particular one was not all that great. So I skipped over that and I went to another one and price wasn't as important to me as just, having a quality product. But batteries actually happen to matter.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're buying batteries and you ask, do I like it? That's an odd criteria. Maybe I wouldn't care as much. But if you see the price first and you're asking, is it worth it? That we really can think about batteries. Oh, well, this is what they're going to do for me. This is the benefit. And so you might make a different decision depending on which piece of information you saw first. Now, I did this work related to brain scans. I saw that the brain activity changed depending on whether you saw price or product first, but I've also done eye tracking research where I track where you look on the screen first. And I found that you also make different buying decisions depending on the kind of other products that an e-commerce site might recommend to you. So if you're looking at board games, for example, my kid loves board games. We always look at board games on a bunch of websites. If the company recommends more board games, other types of board games, is there other recommended items? You're actually more likely to buy than if they recommend candles or towels or other products you could buy on the
Mm.
site. So you may be really enthusiastic about candles or towels normally, but if you are thinking about board games and you see other recommended items, it kind of distracts you from the purpose of buying a board game, and you're less likely to buy what's on the page. Whereas if you see a board game and then you see other board games, I can look at where your eyes are tracking, and you're more likely to buy that board game when it feels like today is a board game kind of decision.
Interesting. I wonder how companies are using these insights to change how they market.
Some of them use them explicitly and some of them use them implicitly. So as much as I would love to go chat with everybody at every website, I haven't necessarily done that myself, but they certainly are using an understanding of how consumers interact with these experiences. Decisions unfold over time. The way that the information is presented, the order of the information, how it's spatially represented on the screen, all of these things matter. And companies look at the insights that we develop as marketing and consumer researchers, but they also do their own testing. They run their own experiments in their firms, and then they try and bring all that information together. So every single piece of a shopper's experience, whether in the store or online, has some relevance to a firm, and probably to some extent has been designed by that firm. Whether it's the way the store is set up, where the product is placed, or which search engine results come up first when you search for a pair of shoes on a website. All of those pieces are involved. What emotional response do we have when we see things that match our interests versus things that are new?
Right.
And which one is the firm trying to achieve at this point in time with this consumer? All of these questions are related to these kinds of psychological insights that the field develops.
Now, Uma, you've been a really productive researcher, and I wonder, in looking at all the work that you've done, all the studies you've done over the course of your academic career so far, are there two or three that really stand out to you and that you had the most fun with?
Oh my goodness. So I mentioned the price first, product first one, and I think that was cool on several dimensions for me. I got to work with some amazing scientists at Stanford University in developing this. I got to think about something that I felt was immediately understandable as a real world problem. Sometimes my research has to start at really basic, really, pretty complex fundamentals and pull apart the pieces before I can say anything meaningful about the real world. Do you see the price of the product first, and then your brain changes depending on what happens? That seems pretty straightforward and pretty much immediately understandable, but also applicable. So that was a really fun one to work on. And I got to look at people's brains with MRI. So that was also pretty great. Now, I have actually done research that doesn't necessarily use a brain scanner or an eye tracker. I had a great time working on a paper with one of my best friends in the field, Professor Brian Bollinger, who's at NYU. And he and I looked at what happens when people bring their own grocery bags to a store. Now, when you bring your own grocery bag, it's because the store requires it. I'm in California. I believe it's actually, the stores aren't allowed to give you plastic bags anymore. But back when Brian and I were studying this question, it was optional. And it is optional still in a lot of the United States. So you don't have to. They'll offer you a bag, or you can even pay for it. But at this time, if you brought your own grocery bag to the store, you were doing something good, right? You were doing something environmentally friendly. You should be proud of yourself.
Right.
And what we found is that people kind of knew they should be proud of themselves for remembering those grocery bags. So they would buy more treats on the shopping trips when they remembered to bring their own bags compared to the trips when they forgot.
Wow.
And it was, again, very fun, psychologically interesting. We were able to expand on existing science, but also show something that, again, had real world implications. On the trips where you brought your bag, you bought yourself a little treat, maybe a cookie, maybe an extra bit of chips or something like that. And this partnership was really great for that because Brian is a quantitative marketing professor who examined real grocery store data and found these patterns when the loyalty card people brought their bags. And I was able to run complementary experiments where I asked people to think about remembering having brought their bags, or just my control condition, just go into the store and you shop for things. And we asked people what they would buy, and when they were told they had brought their bags in the experiments, or when they brought their bags in real life, more cookies, more chips, more ice cream went into their carts.
So the takeaway for me is that if I owned a supermarket, not only encourage my customers to bring their own bags, but I would have signs in the store that say, you are doing a great thing for the environment. Treat yourself today to this.
That would be potentially one of the takeaways for sure. Interestingly enough, this is one of those pieces of science that's a little bit of a time. If you require people to bring their own bags, they don't get that little benefit anymore because they know they're doing it because you told them to. It's like mom requiring it as opposed to them remembering. So you don't see the same effect. So the laws that went into effect probably increased people bringing their own bags and have a lot of positive policy effects for the environment, but may have actually changed our psychology finding a little bit, because when someone tells you to, you don't do it. If you get punished, if you forget, like if you have to pay money to get a bag, you don't see the same treat because now you feel bad about it. So you still got a reusable grocery bag, but you feel guilty, and so you don't buy that treat anymore.
I wonder how your research has affected your own buying habits, because most of what you're describing is unconscious, right? It's behavior that is stimulated by different things, but you may not be constantly thinking about it, but because you've done this research, when you enter a store or an e-commerce site, this is more present in your mind, and I wonder how it affects your own decisions. Does it make you more intentional about buying something?
Yes, in a very specific way. So first of all, sometimes it's really just fun not to be intentional, right?
Mm.
Like shopping is a fun experience. And
Oh,
I don't want to dismiss, I am also a policy professor. I don't want to dismiss very real concerns about consumption and overconsumption, or, a consideration of crowding of information and attention in the market. I think those are important problems. But I also think that there's a reason why Gen Xers and 80s kids went to the mall to hang out, because sometimes it's just fun, even if you don't spend the money. So sometimes I just browse for fun and I don't think about any of this. But when I am actively shopping, what I try and remind myself is, do I want this? Right? Beyond the automatic response, beyond the ooh, shiny, how much do I love this? Do I want this? And can I use it? And a little bit of, will I want it tomorrow? And I think those gut checks are really helpful. There's this, honestly, sort of lay piece of advice, this sort of stereotypical piece of advice that you shouldn't go to the grocery store hungry and you should always have a list. So that way you won't buy things you don't need. And as much as that sounds boring compared to all the shiny brain scans, it's really good advice. If you tell yourself what you want explicitly, that has the potential to override other people telling you what you want. So when you can identify what you want, what you need, why you want it, you're the strongest voice in your own head. And so that, I think, those reminders, do I need this? Do I want this? And will I still like it tomorrow? They're not perfect. They won't work perfectly for anyone, but I think I have found myself using them more often given the kind of research I do.
right. But how does your work actually help people be more intentional about what they buy? I mean, there's a whole issue of there's a generation of people who are very concerned about climate change, and sustainability is important to them. And they're increasingly making more healthy choices and choices that are more in line with sustainable farming and agriculture.
Absolutely. So I should say right away that a lot of the work that I do, as much as I think it has application, does start with that basic science.
Uh,
So understanding the processes don't necessarily tell you how to shape them for any one individual. So I can tell you that you treat yourself a little bit when you bring your own bag, and you could interpret that as, oh, that's great, it'll help me learn that habit. You could also interpret that as, actually I shouldn't buy any more ice cream. I already buy enough. So it's a little bit of a trade-off. one of the broad things about understanding the process, though, is that you have access to that knowledge, right? You can understand the factors that impact you or don't. And then, as I was sort of alluding to before, you can choose how much you want to pay attention to those factors or how much you want to be in control or conscious about those decisions. And so, again, relying a little bit on a trite saying, in this case, knowledge is power, and that it gives you more agency over those decisions. It gives you the option to stop, to take a moment to check whether those factors might be influential. And so I think the
Right.
more we know about which factors matter and how they might be pushing us one way or the other does help. I think the other thing is, you can use these insights to help you achieve the goals you have. One of the things we've seen broadly in consumer psychology is that if you know what you want, these small little shifts one way or the other are not the things that are going to radically change your mind. It's when you don't know what you want, it's when you're browsing or you're open or you don't know what the options are, that these factors have the most influence. So I like the word intentionality a lot, like developing those ideas and then deciding what you want, what you don't want, or whether there are just boundaries to what you're willing to do, helps you recognize how some of those factors might be leaning you in one direction or the other, and then checking against those boundaries.
Right.
I do think, though, that an awareness of the fact that the information that you get is not neutral is helpful. And I think that the modern consumer has a lot of that awareness now. We've heard about nudges, if I can pull from that behavioral economics and policy piece. We've certainly heard about nudges, whether they're used to do pro-social, pro-environmental actions, or whether you sometimes get nudged into keeping a subscription that you didn't want, or, like these little patterns that nudge you in directions you might not want. Knowing what nudges are, knowing how your decisions interact with the tools that you get to make these choices can be helpful in following goals related to consumption, to overconsumption. But also substitution is helpful. So if we know that buying is this little exciting moment of getting something, right? This little award, this little win in your day, can we do something that fits our overarching goals better? Can we find something new? Can we find a substitute reward? Can we activate those same brain areas with things that, instead of trying to make us feel self-control, can still give us that win without necessarily breaking our consumption goals?
Right. Now, every MBA program has a core marketing course. I'm thinking that your way of teaching in that core must differ given your research and how you're coming to the topic. And I wonder how your research and how your multidisciplinary thinking has informed the way you even teach a marketing course in the core curriculum.
I think for a student who's just learning marketing and just starting out, they're still going to need to pick up the fundamentals. And so there are pieces that are going to be the same across every single core. I also think that these really, to me, interesting insights about the brain are integral to marketing. And so I don't think of these as pieces that I would add in or subtract out, but that I can enrich the overall experience in class. So on the first day of class, we often talk about how marketing changes our perception of the world around us. I think, and not to malign any incoming students, but I think often when people think of marketing, they think of advertising, right? This is people trying to get you to buy stuff.
Yeah.
And day one of marketing is, if your firm hasn't done something to create value, then you're doing it wrong. And so people are like, oh, well, that's just marketing. It's not the real world. The real thing is the product. This is just marketing. So I show them data from actually a study that a friend of mine, Hilke Plasman, ran many years ago, where she had people drinking wine in an fMRI scanner. And depending on which wine they were drinking, she would show them the price of the wine while they were drinking it, and she was scanning their brains. And people showed more brain activity to higher priced wine. Now, the trick she pulled on these people, which you may be familiar with, is that sometimes they were drinking the same wine that was marked $10 as when they were drinking that same wine marked at $100. And the more they thought the cost of the wine was, not only the more they said they enjoyed it, but the more positively their brain responded to the taste. So something as simple as knowing the price from Hilke's study changes how good something tastes. From my research, changes the way you make decisions. And so I think showing that marketing changes your thinking and has real world impacts, changes the way that consumers experience, that people experience products and services and shopping and eating in restaurants and day-to-day life is really important in understanding why getting this right is valuable. You know, the idea is not to trick consumers. The idea is to give them the best experience possible from the perspective of the firm. And from the consumer, the point is to enjoy the thing that you paid money for. And if marketing, you know, if you drink wine out of a glass, a lovely wine glass compared to a plastic cup, it is a different experience. It might actually taste better. And people knowing that the neuroscience is there to back that up, knowing that the neuroscience is there to show that we really do have specific relationships with brands with different personalities, knowing that there's neuroscience data demonstrating how we respond to different price levels. I can communicate that in the class in a natural way so that my students can pull all of these pieces together and see the impact of what they're learning and the choices that they're making on people's lives. And so I hope that that's there and present in the core in a way that emphasizes for them how helpful it is to everyone to get this stuff right.
I can resonate with that wine study because if I'm drinking a wine that I think would cost more, I'll probably enjoy it more. But if I'm drinking a wine that I paid more money for out of my pocket, now my expectations rise. And now I'm comparing it to my other wines that I've tasted over at least the short-term memory that I have can remember. And now it's a little different. It's a different kind of evaluation than just drinking a wine that I think is more expensive and I didn't have to pay for it.
So that's amazing. That's a great point. And I think that also speaks to your early question about how do you use this in these
Yeah.
findings, these insights to shape your world. One of the toughest answers that I really do have to give my students and anyone who asks when I consult or when I talk to firms is often that it depends. The more information you know about the context and the specific situation, the more you can shape an understanding or prediction of how it's going to impact someone. Because we are complicated and we are really messy. And that is why it's interesting to take these things out of a carefully controlled lab and put them in the real world to see how variable or how consistent they are. And so finding the things that are consistent, that's the stuff that's going to work most of the time. And finding out when things are variable is an understanding that I can't assume that you are going to respond the same way to price, depending on whether you came at it in terms of who's paying for it, right? So I need to know whether you're the one, you know, signing the bill at the end of the dinner or whether your friend is before I have a good prediction about how you'd respond to drinking that
Right.
wine, at least in terms of how your brain might activate.
Now, if I had the privilege of being a Rady student and sitting in your marketing core course, what would be the case study that you teach, having taught at Harvard Business School, that you most enjoy teaching?
Oh, wow. There's so many different things that they do really
Oh,
well in different ways. So I've taught several cases at the Harvard Business School and several cases at the Rady School. In fact, case method teaching is actually a central part of my core class, because particularly in the field of marketing, working through those problems and interacting with your cohort is a really great way to develop an understanding of that flexibility and variability we're talking about here. Because people are complicated, because marketing is about the psychology of how we think, the more voices you can get in working through those problems, the more sophisticated your understanding of marketing becomes. So I do use cases frequently here. At the Rady School in particular, in many ways, one of my favorite cases is a slightly older one. It's called Medicines Company. And it looks at the pricing of a drug, a blood thinner drug, actually. And every year I think, maybe this is the year that I should maybe look at a different case because this one's a little bit older. And every year I realize how many people we have in San Diego who are in biotechnology or in
Sure.
pharma or who are interested in science. And one of the really interesting things about the medicines case is that it forces you to think about what you can and can't put a price on and what value really means to people. And then it puts you in a very specific kind of business that has an interaction with government and health and policy and practical application of this and business to business conversations. And so that is a really interesting set of conversations to have where you can pull in a bunch of different factors and a lot of the scientific expertise that we have at UCSD in the San Diego community. So in many ways, that's not the funnest, like most exciting case from the top down, from the way it looks from the top down, but it's one of the ones where we have one of the most deep and engaged discussions in my class. I will
Fantastic.
say though that cases on really interesting businesses like Casper Mattress, where you get a mattress delivered to you in a box and like how that might disrupt the whole industry. Those are very fun to teach. Analyzing ads, we do mini cases on specific media like advertising for Nike versus advertising for the NFL. Or just understanding the way that different marketing actions actually change the whole strategy of the business. All of those pieces of insights are a lot of fun to go through.
Yeah, I would think that it's really great fun and really informative to sit in that classroom with you. Absolutely.
Well,
Well,
thank you for
thank
that.
you so much for being with us. I really appreciate it. And if any one of you are fascinated by this discussion and want to explore more about how you can actually sit in Uma's class, go to the UC San Diego Rady School of Management website. There's tons of information about the programs that they offer, and obviously the MBA program where Uma teaches in the core. Thanks for a fascinating discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, this is John Byrne with Poets and Quants. You've been watching Uma Karmarkar, who is at actually a joint appointment, again, I'll point out, which is unusual in and of itself in many cases, at the Rady School of Management and UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. Thanks for joining us.